In late March of 2018, Brewster withdrew his intent to pursue an insanity defense, saying, quote, "Our intent is to tell Michael Bever's story in an authentic way and hope that the members of the jury receive the truth about what happened and are able to consider the evidence in the case and the whole story. We believe when the jury hears all of the story in this case, they are going to find that Michael's not in the same position as his brother Robert." Kunzweiler was upset about the announcement just 2 weeks shy of the hearing. He said, quote, "Quite frankly, I don't know where to begin in responding to that notice. My office has expended countless hours and thousands of taxpayer dollars to retain and consult with an expert in anticipation of that defense. I don't want to even think about the thousands of taxpayer dollars that have been expended by the public defender's office in going down that rabbit trail. But it is exceptionally frustrating as a citizen of this community to have put as much effort as I have put into this, only to be told, never mind." Hi, I'm your host, Zach Williams. Welcome to Compulsion. Brewster was also attempting to have DA Sarah McAmis recused from the trial under the accusation that she may have been responsible for misplacing evidence. Brewster once again brought up the mitigating circumstances that he believed needed to be taken into account not only in the trial, but in regards to statements Michael gave immediately after being arrested. Apparently, he was asked several questions before being read his Miranda rights. And when a public defender's office investigator tried to meet with Michael, the police insisted on finishing their 2-hour-long interview with him before allowing the legal counsel in. Brewster said this was a violation of the Sixth Amendment, and that law enforcement, quote, "knowingly subjected him to an inquisition into the tragic deaths of his family members without an attorney or friendly adult present to aid him." Holmes said she needed to listen to the recordings of the police interview and take some time before making a decision that day. On April 10th, Judge Holmes listened to Brewster's arguments to have McAmis removed from the trial. Adcock, who had returned to town to give testimony, said she did call DA Sarah McAmis while she was at the auction house, but they only talked about whether or not the items at the house could be used as evidence. Since they had fallen outside of police custody, they could not be admitted. Adcock said, quote, "I was upset that I did not take those particular items the night of the homicides. Had I known then what I know now, I would have done things differently." Adcock did concede, however, that she did not disclose the items at the auction house when meeting with the attorneys on both sides, and that she had been following McAmis's lead, who knew but also notably did not mention the items. Adcock said she still did not know what happened to the hard drive. Quote, "This is baffling me. I've been trying to figure this out for several months now." McAmis denied knowing anything about Adcock's visit to the auction house and said she was not a reliable witness, as she had given conflicting accounts about what happened during her internal affairs investigation. Later during the trial, it would come out that one of the bags containing one of the surveillance cameras had been opened and not resealed properly, somewhere along the chain of custody. Judge Holmes ruled in favor of McAmis and told Brewster that she would not be removed from the trial as there was no evidence of wrongdoing. On April 15th, 2018, the trial kicked off. Brewster said, quote, "We're going to give it our best shot, and we're going to keep fighting for Michael. He's been in 23-hour isolation for the last 2.5 years. He was put there within hours of his family dying. It's been tremendously hard for him. This trial's going to be tremendously hard for him. I think it's going to be hard for everyone involved, honestly." On April 16th, it was announced that Crystal would testify during the trial that her brothers were determined to become serial killers, with a body count to rival that of the most notorious mass murderers. Kunzweiler told Judge Holmes that Crystal might testify about previously unknown information. He said that she had mentioned that they had asked her to join in the murder spree. Brewster asked Judge Holmes to suppress any evidence that hadn't been disclosed at discovery, and she agreed to a pretrial hearing to listen to the evidence. Meanwhile, over 100 people were summoned to take the jury questionnaire. By the next day, on April 17th, the jury pool had been taken down to just 30 potential candidates. Kunzweiler wanted to prepare the jury for Crystal's testimony and the fact she may have gaps in her memory due to how traumatic that day was for her. He asked one juror about a memorable day in his past, and he recounted a high school football game. But when asked about the weather that day and other details that would seem important to the context, he was unable to remember. Kunzweiler asked the jury to not judge Crystal too harshly in her statements, and not hold her to a higher standard than they would hold themselves to. By April 19th, the jury had been narrowed down to just 11 people. One juror had left after saying they did not want to see photos of, quote, slaughtered children. That day, Crystal gave her testimony on a live stream from another courtroom so that she would not have to directly confront her brother. At the time of this testimony, both she and Autumn had been adopted into a permanent home together. When Michael listened to her testimony, he cried. Kunzweiler said, quote, "I am very grateful to the court for the arrangements she has made to try to make it easier on this young lady. I'm glad she was able to get through it, and will move on with the rest of our trial next week." In late April, the prosecution began showing crime scene photos to the jury that included post-mortem photos of the dead. Several jurors lost their composure, and a box of tissues was passed around. On April 24th of 2018, Brewster objected during the prosecution's testimony to the large amount of crime scene photos being shown to the jury. He said, quote, "They want to bombard the jury with dozens, if not hundreds, of bloody photos. They are intended to overwhelm the jury with sympathy and overwhelm the jury with shock value." McAmis argued that numerous photos were needed to show the true extent of the crime. 70 photos had been shown, and the prosecution had a few hundred ready. Brewster said, quote, "It's hard to get past the magnitude of the loss of life. 6 victims. When you see the evidence in this case, to put that in the back of your mind and really make a rational, critical decision on what did Michael Bever do or what did Michael Bever not do, it's easy to get overwhelmed with the crime scene. We're just doing our best to make sure the court gets that right and we don't overwhelm the jury." Steve Kunzweiler argued that the evidence was important and said, quote, "I'm not going to sit there and say that this jury doesn't need to get my best evidence. I'm going to fight hard to make sure they have a complete and full understanding of what this is about. And if that means I'm putting in a lot of photographs, then I'm going to put in a lot of photographs. I'm not going to soft pedal this case. It's a quintuple homicide, and we've asked jurors to listen to all that evidence. It's not easy for them to look at, but I'm not going to soft pedal this case." The first week of the trial consisted largely of the prosecution showing crime scene photos and interviewing first responders. They had Jackie Smithson on the stand for a collective 7 hours. He had been the detective responsible for taking photographs the night of the murders. He remained composed until he was asked to identify the post-mortem photos of Victoria and Christopher. This caused a few members of the jury to join him in tearing up. He said, quote, "There were red scenes in every room, and the evidence documentation had taken him around 17 hours. Judge Sharon Holmes ruled that the 118 autopsy photos did not need to be shown in court, as there were no questions about the cause of death for the Bever family. McAmis maintained that showing the photos was needed because she did not believe it was possible for one person to have caused the sheer level of carnage alone, and that Michael must have participated. When Brewster asked how the state planned on handling Adcock's role in the collection of digital evidence, Kunzweiler responded, quote, "I've never seen in this case any evidence to suggest that a computer killed any one of the 5 people or a hard drive was responsible for the death of any of these people. To which Brewster said, quote, "We haven't yet heard any evidence that Michael was responsible for any of the deaths either." Brewster once again accused them of simply trying to overwhelm the jury with graphic photos, rather than present evidence that Michael had actively participated in the slayings. The second week of the trial followed a similar pattern, with a crime scene investigator recounting finding 2 bloody knives that had previously been missed, as well as the shipping box addressed to Robert that had contained body armor. He'd gotten it in February, adding more evidence to the slayings being planned. The prosecution once again tried to show the autopsy photos, but Judge Holmes refused them. Kunzweiler said he is not going to rush showing the jury the evidence. In the third week of the trial, Ryan Woolley spoke on behalf of the prosecution and showed a series of photos of a journal taken from the room both boys had shared at the Bever household. He said that, quote, "It basically offered right now as corroboration of what we expect to be a statement that will be attributed to Michael Bever." Though when the prosecution would read statements from this journal later, it was clearly Robert's, and why they would present it as Michael's is unclear. In May, criminologist Megan Jones testified that she had identified 2 bloody handprints in the Bever home as belonging to Michael Bever. One on the doorframe leading into the bathroom where Victoria and Christopher were hiding. Another was on the front door, indicating that he had been the one to drag Crystal back inside. Jones could not identify Michael's fingerprints on any of the murder weapons. Robert Bever was wearing gloves for at least part of the murders, but there were several prints that Jones had sent to Adcock to improve the quality of, and she never heard back. Several items were never tested for DNA or prints, and more than one evidence bag had been opened without permission and not resealed. An analysis of the blood samples taken from both brothers the night of the murder would show Robert had blood from every member of his family on him, while Michael had his own blood and 2 samples that were definitely from April found on him. 2 of the knives used had a contaminated mix of samples and could have had blood or DNA from both the brothers. The testifying expert discussed the possible problems with accuracy of the findings, as familial relations and mixed samples made some of the blood and DNA found difficult to determine. The most damning evidence against Michael was a spot of his blood found on the sheath of a knife that had a large amount of Daniel's blood on it. The defense, in lieu of showing autopsy photos, had witnesses come forward to describe in detail the injuries inflicted upon each family member. During the testimony of the second witness describing the extent of injuries inflicted upon Victoria, Brewster asked the witness, quote, "And we can rule out bludgeoning by closed-circuit TV camera," while glancing at Kunzweiler, who quickly told the witness he did not have to answer that. On May 4th, Robert Bever returned to the witness stand. He had tattoos on his hands that read LWOPX5 and life. When shown a picture of the hatchet recovered from the crime scene, he started crying. Brewster asked him what was wrong. He said, quote, "There's a lot of blood. There's a lot of blood. I'm sorry. I don't know what I was thinking." Since his incarceration, Robert had been diagnosed with a variety of mental illnesses, including psychotic tendencies and depression, as well as schizophrenia. This had been the first time in his life he had been to a mental health professional, as his family was distrustful of the outside world and hadn't taken the children to physicians either. Robert said, quote, "I'm not denying that we acted together, but we acted in our own ways." Robert said that when he first stabbed Crystal, Michael asked, quote, "Robert, what are you doing?" Robert described their childhood as being lonely. He said, quote, "We could go months without leaving the house except to buy groceries." He said his parents told the children to keep away from the windows and said, quote, "They told us the world was full of people who wanted to hurt us." David and April also discussed the rapture and biblical apocalypse often, saying it would be, quote, "a retribution thing for everything they hated about the world." Robert claimed that David would tell him, quote, "I can kill you anytime I want to." Robert said that was part of why he'd started stockpiling the body armor, to feel safe. Quote, "It meant he couldn't kill me. Every time I put the body armor on, I was empowered." Robert described the mentality he was in the night of the murders as, quote, flipping the kill switch. Robert said that later, in police custody, he realized they would never have been able to carry around all of the ammo they'd ordered. He laughed on the witness stand when saying, quote, imagine us trying to carry all that around during a shooting spree. I just realized how fickle this plan was. He said even if he had been 21, he didn't have enough money to buy the guns he'd ordered. Then he went on to wonder about the strategy of other mass shooters, saying, quote, I can't figure out how the others did it, before Judge Holmes cut him off. Of Robert's testimony, Brewster said, quote, if I had just described him to you, you wouldn't have believed it. Imagine what Robert must have been like in 2015, unmedicated. Soon afterward, jurors finally viewed the police tape of Michael's interview, taken shortly after he was arrested. He said of the attack that, quote, basically, we did what we planned to do. During this recording, Brewster insisted on passing around copies of Michael Bever's statement, as it contained numerous spelling errors, and the handwriting was nearly illegible. They were also shown his journal from prison. It was abundantly clear that Michael struggled to write and had no idea how to spell even the most basic of words. It took the jury half an hour to read his page-long statement because the handwriting was so illegible. The night of the murders, Michael told Bentz that Robert, quote, says he hates everyone and says he thinks society is pointless. He also said numerous times that he didn't take the plan seriously or really think they were going to happen, saying, quote, I didn't take it seriously at first. It kept escalating. Michael said when Crystal was first attacked, quote, she fell down and started screaming. I kind of freaked out because I wasn't planning on this. He admitted to stabbing April and Christopher. He claims he stabbed Christopher in the neck, but this contradicts the later autopsy report, and Christopher's blood was not found on him. He was supposed to shoot David with a crossbow while he was still asleep, but David woke up. He said that he was scared and regretted the plan as soon as it started, but was afraid Robert would kill him too if he didn't go along with it. Michael said Robert, quote, was going to do it no matter what. He said if I didn't, he would kill me too. At one point, Michael said of Robert that, quote, he just wanted to be famous. I just wanted to get my learner's permit. The second day Robert testified, he said that he'd previously lied about Michael's involvement that day. He called the prosecution's mental health expert, quote, shady. He said, quote, I thought we were going to be famous, and I didn't want Michael to feel like I was pushing him out. I wanted to share it with him. Robert would later say that he never actually saw Michael stab or kill anyone. McAmis read several statements from Robert's diary, which he had previously insinuated belonged to Michael. He said Michael was, quote, a sneaky bastard, and that, quote, I can't think of anyone I'd rather rampage with. Robert would later say of the testimony he gave that he was lying most of the time and trying to play up kind of a character. He said the police yelling made him nervous and he was rambling a lot, but not really thinking about what he was saying. At one point, he said Michael charged into the bathroom after kicking open the door, quote, like a macho cowboy. On May 8th, both sides argued for over an hour and a half in the judge's chambers about the tampering of evidence and how relevant it was to the case. That same day, the defense had to rest its case after Holmes ruled that Adcock could not testify and blocked a psychologist from speaking about Michael's cognitive abilities. Brewster said, quote, the prosecutors, I think they objected to every witness that we intended to call, and they certainly very vigorously objected to the scope of testimony that we would be allowed to get into with Adcock. Judge Holmes said, the spoilation of evidence, quote, was probably apparent, but I don't think bad faith was shown. Holmes did not say whether she would ask jurors to consider the statements Michael made immediately after his arrest as being taken under duress. On May 9th, both sides read their closing remarks. McAmis asked the jurors to consider if it was even possible for one person to have inflicted the 141 stab wounds the family suffered. She said that even if the jury believed everything Michael said, he still dragged his sister back inside, disabled the alarm, and tricked his young siblings into opening doors so that Robert could kill them. The prosecution revealed for the first time during their closing remarks that Michael had searched online about familicide and the minimum age in Oklahoma to be given the death penalty, as well as subjects such as torture, guns, and knives. This information was not disclosed anywhere in the discovery process. Brewster said Michael's mental age was closer to 10 years old, possibly referencing what the psychological expert would have said if she'd been allowed to testify. He said that he couldn't be held responsible for his actions the same way an adult could. Brewster said, quote, he got caught on a wave of chaos and mental illness. It was Robert Bever's descent into mental illness, and Michael was put into a container with that. It was a pressure cooker, and it blew up in an awful and overwhelming way. He said Robert was Michael's whole world, and asked the jury to please consider the extraordinary circumstances of the Bever home life. Julie Doss, a member of the prosecution team, thanked the jury, saying, quote, you have heard things and seen things in this courtroom that no one should ever have to see. In her closing remarks, Doss said of Michael, quote, he's helping, he's aiding, he's right in the middle of it. He's putting on his body armor while his younger siblings are putting on their PJs. The jury deliberated for more than 5 hours before finding Michael guilty. Over half of the jurors cried as the verdict was read, and yet again the bailiff passed around a box of tissues. When Michael heard the verdict, he collapsed on the floor, and a deputy helped him up. The jury would then decide the length of sentences for the attempted murder of Crystal and the murder of the rest of his family separately. On May 10th, the jury recommended a sentence of 28 years for the attempted murder of Crystal. They decided on this sentence first, and the prosecution was disappointed. Kunzweiler argued that just because Crystal survived didn't mean the jury should go light on Michael's sentence, and hoped to push for the maximum with the other charges. The appellate court released a statement saying that in order to recommend life without the possibility of parole for Michael, the prosecution must prove he is, quote, irreparably corrupt and permanently incorrigible. Brewster was allowed to bring in the psychologist to discuss mitigating factors for the other charges. He said, quote, this is the time for us to show this jury his humanity. Sarah McAmis reminded that Crystal has to live for the rest of her life with her scars as a reminder of the 20 stab wounds she received. McAmis said she hopes the jury does not decide to give a light sentence to, quote, someone who willingly engaged in mass murder for the purpose of continued mass murder. On May 12th, during arguments for mitigating and aggravating factors, psychologist Dr. Anna Mazur testified that Michael's IQ was, quote, bordering on mental retardation, and he could have mental impairments as a result of multiple head injuries suffered during his childhood. She also said, quote, he grew up in complete isolation, and his role model was a psychopath. The jury decided to pursue the sentence of life with the possibility of parole, with all sentences to be served concurrently, meaning Michael would need to serve 38 years before being eligible. If he was rehabilitated, he would be released at the age of 54. When the verdict was read, he was holding the hand of one of his attorneys and cried, while he thanked the jury as well as Judge Holmes. Brewster said, quote, it meant everything to give him the possibility to make himself better and to work on putting his darkest hour behind him and trying to be a better human being. It was a recognition of Michael Bever's humanity, and that sometimes people are responsible for doing bad things, but they're still human beings, and they still deserve a chance to make themselves better. Brewster also said that he hoped to attend Michael's parole hearing down the line, to which Kunzweiler retorted, quote, when do you want him as your next-door neighbor? The arguments were not over yet, however. Judge Holmes still had to decide if she would follow the jury's recommendation. McAmis said that although it is sad to lock someone away for life, Michael would still have a chance to grow and live his life in prison. She said, quote, you know who didn't get the chance to have hope? Do you know who never got the opportunity to make a difference? Victoria, Christopher, Daniel. Brewster argued once again that Michael did not participate actively in the killings and that, quote, If Michael had tried to stop Robert, the only result would have been one more casualty. Michael took the stand for the first time to appeal to Judge Holmes. He said that, quote, "Every minute and every second, I've been thinking about what I could have done different and what kind of life I could have had with my family." Holmes said she would make her decision in a few weeks, on August 9th, to decide if she wanted to follow the jury's wishes and have the sentences run concurrently, or make them consecutive, and essentially give Michael a life sentence without the possibility of parole. 6 of the 12 jurors wrote the judge a letter, pleading with her to respect their verdict, and 5 showed up to sit in the courtroom while Judge Holmes decided the final verdict on August 9th. Bever told Holmes that, quote, "I want to have a normal life someday. I don't understand what happened. I wake up in the middle of the night and look over thinking that I'm going to ask one of my little brothers a question. Even 3 years later, I can't believe that it actually happened." Kunzweiler quickly pointed out that Michael did not apologize. Kunzweiler once again argued that Michael had helped plan the attacks, and he read an emotional letter written by Crystal and Autumn's adoptive mother. In the letter, the mother talks about Crystal's PTSD and the extent of her injuries suffered at the hands of her brothers. She said Autumn is very clingy and afraid of being abandoned because her parents were taken from her when she was so young. She said that both the girls are doing remarkably well despite their trauma, and hopes that the jury won't choose to grant the possibility of parole to the person responsible for that trauma. She said if Michael is ever released from prison, she worries that both girls will spend the rest of their lives looking over their shoulders. Brewster closed his argument by saying, quote, "Several jurors are here today. I can't imagine the disrespect it would show to them if this court did something else." At the end of the court session on August 9th, 2018, Judge Holmes read her verdict. She first thanked the jurors for their hard work during such an emotional case that brought tears from those in attendance on a daily basis. Then she reiterated that she had read the letter the jury wrote, but final discretion was up to the court. Judge Holmes then ruled that the sentences run consecutively, meaning Michael Bever will never see the light of day outside of prison. Meanwhile, the Bever family home had been torn down. At the groundbreaking ceremony for the memorial park, Mike Lester said, quote, "It's not a joyous occasion, nor a somber one. The park would be named the Bever Family First Responders Memorial Garden." Lester said that if the girls ever decided to visit, he hoped it would help show them that the community cared about them. On March 27th of 2019, the city of Broken Arrow finished construction on the memorial park. Mike Lester said, quote, "We can never erase the tragedy that occurred here, but we are making a statement with Reflection Park that we will not allow evil to define who we are and the high standards we hold as a community. Thanks to the generosity of so many people in Broken Arrow and the metro area, we have built a place of peace and serenity. The park has a gazebo and flower gardens to attract butterflies. It connects to the park in the adjacent lot and is meant to be a place of reflection." Mike Lester said, quote, "This is not a day that we've come to celebrate. It's to show respect for those who are lost, to show support for the 2 sisters that remain, and to honor our first responders who gave so much that night." In July of 2019, Robert Bever attempted to attack a prison guard with a sharpened instrument. The guard quickly subdued him. Other than that incident, he has stayed out of the headlines, but he already has the fame he wanted so badly. The Broken Arrow murders have a Wikipedia page and have dominated the Oklahoma news circuit for years. On June 25th of 2020, Michael's appeal was rejected. Brewster had argued that, quote, "Michael Bever's consecutive life sentences are a violation of the 6th and 8th Amendments to the United States Constitution and Oklahoma and federal case law, because the jury's verdict was that Michael was, quote, not irreparably corrupt and permanently incorrigible." But his appeal was shut down in the Court of Criminal Appeals. Brewster said he plans on taking Michael's case to the Supreme Court. He wants to challenge the right of individual states to be allowed to have vastly different laws than the Supreme Court has for how to deal with underage offenders. Just like his predecessor, Rob Nye, he is determined to see this case through and take it as far as it needs to go. Music is provided by Hexsystem. Tulsa World provided a majority of our sources for this episode and provided very accurate and thorough coverage on this case. For a full list of our sources or links to our contributors, please see our show notes. Follow us on Twitter or Instagram at CompulsionCast to stay up to date on our latest episodes and news. See you in 2 weeks.